Hello, folks. Pastor Jim Curran, Brush Arbor Baptist Church. I'd like to welcome you to this last in a series of Baptist history sermons on Isaac McCoy, and we hope they've been a blessing to your heart. Today, we're going to look at the dangers of denominationalism. Now, why would that be a part of this subject? Well, as we look at the life of Isaac McCoy, we see that often the mission faced very difficult times. And as we look at that, we're going to see this stemmed a lot very much from that idea of denominationalism that went on. But first, we're going to look here at Philippians and chapter 4. The Apostle Paul here writes to the Philippian church that has been an aid to him and an encouragement to him and supported his needs when he had them. And he says this here in chapter 4, verse 10, "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein you were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound everywhere. In all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. Notwithstanding, you've done well that you did communicate with my affliction. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only." Notice this was done by a church. For even in Thessalonica, which is the next place he went after he was in Philippi, you sent once and again unto my necessity, not because I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. But I have all and abound. I am full, having received of Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you, an odor of a sweet smell, a sacrifice acceptable, well-pleasing to God. But my God shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. Let's go before the Lord in prayer. God, I pray you'd help us as we look today at your word and at history. And Lord, I pray it would be an encouragement to each heart and a help to each heart. Help us ever to keep you as head of our churches and to ever do what's right in your eyes. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Missions is the heartbeat of a church. The Great Commission, which goes not only to our Jerusalem, but to the uttermost part of the earth, is the marching orders. We are to go, and we can't go individually just to where we're at in our Jerusalem. Maybe we can go a little bit to our Judea outside of that, but beyond that to Samaria and to the uttermost part of the earth, it takes somebody else and to partner with them. And that's exactly what the Philippian Christians did here in this passage. They partnered with the Apostle Paul. And many other churches partnered with him in helping the church of Jerusalem. But it was a function of the church. As we've seen, Isaac McCoy faced a tremendous amount of hardships in his ministry, and many of them were the result of things not being done the way they should have been. Now, as the modern mission movement arose, there was a need to support these missionaries that were going out. Of course, William Carey, for Americans, the main impetus, the main push was because of Adoniram Judson on the way to India, becoming a Baptist as he came there, becoming convinced of Baptist principles, getting the Carey mission, being baptized by William Carey. Then we began to fund that. Well, before this point, largely missions have been conducted through associations, and they were a more Judea type of thing, where they went out to the surrounding area and worked out from there. Now we're going to the uttermost part of the earth. So the thought was, let's build something that enables us to support them and to put our monies together as individual churches and to be able to support them. And that's a good idea if it's done properly. This is a group effort, just like what happened with Paul and the churches at Jerusalem. But when it's done improperly, it can become a means to which control is exerted. If it's done improperly, you don't know where your missions money is going. If it's done improperly, you don't even know who your missionaries are. Now, when McCoy first started out, he proposed a local missions society. And he was actually first sent out by the Long Run Association, and Mariah Creek is his home church where he pastored. Sent out, went across Illinois, clear to St. Louis. He was burdened for St. Louis, and he wanted to go to St. Louis as a missionary, as well as to reach out to the Indians. And he began to formulate this idea of a mission society among the churches there among Long Run, as well as the recently forming Wabash Association there. And as he did this, he would get word of what was called the Triennial Convention. It would meet every 3 years, and it was an effort to try and form an association that would be countrywide. It evolved into much more, sad to say. But under that, they would start the American Board of Foreign Missions. Now, that was an outgrowth largely intended, it started largely in New England, largely to help finance Adoniram Judson. And while good on the surface, as we're going to find, there were some undercurrents underneath that were certainly not good. Now, McCoy would get wind of this, and it sounded like a tremendous idea. In theory, it was. In practice, it became something more. Now, McCoy would write to the board and request appointment as a missionary to the Indians. That was on March 26th, 1817. One of the ones really involved, and basically the point man on the board, was a man called Luther Rice. He had actually sailed, not on the same ship, but he had sailed with Adoniram Judson, and two had become convinced of Baptist principles on the way, and two was baptized by Carey. He came back to help finance the mission, and he intended to go back. He wound up never having that opportunity to go back. Now, Luther Rice was aware of McCoy, and Rice had encouraged him and McCoy's wish was to be appointed to St. Louis. Rice had actually encouraged him in this. Now, McCoy would write, instead of his already expressed wishes where he wanted to go, he would suddenly find out that J.M. Peck and James Walsh were appointed as missionaries to St. Louis. Now, the St. Louis mission would face many of the problems that McCoy's would. It was underfunded. In 3 years, it would be closed down because the mission support did not come in. Now, enter in, at this point, the corresponding secretary, which was William Stanton. And he encouraged McCoy. He would be appointed to cover the Wabash and White River areas in Indiana and Illinois. And he was appointed for 1 year with an option to continue if party should be of one mind. Now, understand, as we're writing this out, every time any communication will go, and this is relevant for everything that we see here, if you would send a letter, it would take 2 to 4 months for communication to go back and forth, generally more towards the 4 month. And if that was everybody replied the day they received it. So if you waited a week, things would get even longer. So communication back and forth was very difficult. Now, McCoy left in kind of a state of uncertainty. He left with the blessing and the sending of Mariah Creek Baptist Church there, and to start the work there on Raccoon Creek, north of what's now Terre Haute, Indiana. That was November of 1818. He was underfunded. The board had promised to support him, but that support really hadn't materialized. Now, in January of 1819, Isaac got a letter Basically, what he hoped to hear would be your contract is renewed, and instead of that, he got quote, "The board is anxious to see the cause of the Redeemer spread throughout the nations, and in particular degree to hear of its influence on the Indian bosom. It also wishes its missionaries to be comfortable to the utmost of its ability." Upon put McCoy throughout the rest of his ministry in a strange position. He was considered a missionary of the board always. He was supported by the board. He was encouraged by. He was printed as a missionary. He's called a missionary. But in some ways, he was never really officially commissioned. He could commission missionaries. That put McCoy kind of in a strange situation. He was told by the board that they would honor all of his drafts. And then later on in the same letter, they put up to $500 a year, which wasn't enough to do what he needed. But he'd be given authorization to get grants for missionary work with the government for the education of the Indians. Now, understand, we'll look at this later on, but that was a grant for the education of the Indians. Under the treaties, that was something that was promised. And as such, they kept this as a separation of church and state. That was intended to employ a teacher, a blacksmith, to do what we would call today adult education in regards to farming, agriculture, animal husbandry. All of those areas were covered under this, and it was kept separate, and those that taught it were kept separate, and their finances were put to be separate. And he was authorized to get those grants, and he'd be treated and praised like a missionary, but other times he'd be ignored. He was even encouraged to sell subscriptions to the Baptist magazine, The Latter-day Luminary, but they often ignored his work there. Now, as we move on with McCoy as he went to Fort Wayne, he found the situation there at Raccoon Creek untenable. The Indians were rapidly moving away from that area, and he needed to find another place. He was offered the buildings there at Fort Wayne. The Raccoon Creek property was ultimately sold, and the board got any profits out of that, even though McCoy poured some of his money into that. They contacted, but anyhow, as he went to Fort Wayne, they would go there, and they would start up an Indian school there as well. And under those treaties that were put forth, especially the Treaty of Chicago that would happen shortly thereafter, and McCoy there, as he came to Fort Wayne, was authorized to draw on the board for, they said, for $500 every 2 months. Most of this never materialized. Now, he had 60 to 70 people relying on between teachers, between the Indian students, his family, other missionaries that would come later. He'd run a training farm. He'd run a blacksmith. That was not really enough to handle that. Now, the board put stipulations on him. Now, the amount from the government was to go to the board. And then they were supposed to send that on. And then McCoy could raise money, but any money that McCoy raised was supposed to go to the board. And then the board was supposed to do that. And then that was the place to be credit to the board. Now, understand there are some things here that happens here. If that money, government money, was used for another purpose other than what it was put forth, that was illegal. And to take those monies that were designated for the Indian mission and use them in another area was unethical. So as we see this, what was promised, what was materialized, was two different things. And honestly, this was just simply bad administration. And the board would show themselves two-faced and with a double standard of many times. Now, as we come on this, as this report comes where he's authorized to draw on this for $500 every 2 months, one wonders how much of this was for public consumption. Now, enter William Stanton. Now, William Stanton would later become a friend of McCoy. And I'm not discounting that later on, but in the beginning, it was kind of a very rocky relationship. Now, while they're saying 500 every 2 months, then in the margins of this same letter that has this down there that says that he's went to McCoy with the blessing of the board, Stanton writes a nasty little letter on the side. That, at most it would be 500 a year and then maybe 200 above that. And he'd been shocked at the needs of the building and that was done there, and then that they done there, and that he moved to Fort Wayne despite the fact that it was with the blessing of the board. He discussed it with them. He couldn't understand how the mission was consuming so much money. Well, you got to understand, on the frontier, things could, if you were talking as the board wanted for them to do, if you were to purchase on credit, it would cost about 8 times as much as what it would in the East. The same amount of foodstuffs, the same amount of those things. And the board never understood that. They didn't understand the needs of the missionaries. They didn't see that. McCoy suffered from the same traders that overcharged the Indians, and the requirement for them to rely on credit just made things even more expensive. And on the side of that margin was a note there about the large quantities of pork, all capitalized exclamation points on the end of it. Now, I think that's kind of shocking. Now, understand, they're working out of log buildings. They're trying to support 60 to 70 people there. They're working to a tribe that's destitute. And as you read McCoy's journals, as you read History of Baptist Indian Missions, you see a mission family that's often just on the brink of starvation. It's only the Lord's provision that takes care of them many times. And they don't see that. And while he's upbraiding that, in a later letter, they get onto him for having some coffee and some tea. Now, I tell you what, and flour. Oh, heavens, we can't have flour. Now, I think it's kind of telling here. Many times we see things that are kind of hypocritical, and I think one of the cases has to be this. Understand, Stanton was pastor of a large church in Philadelphia. They had just built a building that was worth $40,000 in that day's money, and they received from pew rents. Now, understand, folks, that's not scriptural. They borrowed that from the Episcopalians. They borrowed all that from that, but they would receive $10,000 a year from pew rents and offerings. Now, to put that in today's money, and this is without figuring increases in witness, that building was worth about $1 million in today's money, and the offerings would be about $113,000 a year. Now, understand, he's getting angry at McCoy for the very things that are sitting on his table. I don't know how much of that was the rest of the board that pushed that forward, and I don't know how that went on, but this showed several things here. Number one, the board did not understand the needs of the field like missionaries do. Now, we that are pastors need to understand we don't know what our missionaries go through like what they do. Sometimes we come into this with false expectations, and we expect the missionary in England to see the same results that a missionary in the Philippines is doing. That's not true. The missionaries see their field the best way, and we don't understand it like what they do. And they sure didn't understand the expenses. We're used to paying so much for gas. You go overseas, many times it can be $6 for what we pay $2 for. So they didn't understand the needs financially, and they sure didn't understand the needs of the Indians, because many times they try to micromanage them in a different way. Now, this letter kind of sets the stage for what is to follow. Now, a corresponding secretary would come on the scene, often very hostile, as Stanton did, but they bark orders, and as time would go on, they begin to understand and support the mission more, become more of a friend of McCoy. And then the corresponding secretary would change. Next would be Lucius Bowles. He would come on very much just like what Stanton did. And and then they change, and this had happened, and the board would change, and everything would reshuffle and become just as hostile as what they started to begin with. And they began to exert control over the missionaries, as we'd see that. And the finances of the mission were often very tenuous because they never knew what to expect from the board. And understand, what was promised and what was delivered were often two very different things. Now, as an example, as they got to Cary outside of Niles, Michigan, as they went further into the Indian Territory, as that again spaced out, they would get another letter, this time that would say everything's being completely reshuffled. Now, you can raise funds, but again, it has to be sent to Boston first, and then it comes back to you. Now, the funds many times have been raised to take care of some of the debts of the mission because they had that. And one time, as McCoy would go to come back to Cary, arrived home from that, and he did a whole tour, raised support for the mission. Everything went to Boston, and most of it disappeared. And he arrived to come home to the mission to find down to the last couple barrels of meal. So what was going on? What causes all this? And it wasn't just McCoy. The other Indian mission at Valley Towns was seeing much the same thing. Now, they probably treated them a little bit better than what they did McCoy, but where was this money going? And that's not to mention the government money that didn't show up and that they included in these totals that actually was way more than the totals were to begin with. Where was this money going? Well, I got an answer for you. Where all money goes to disappear, Washington, D.C. No, it didn't go to the government. It went to a place called Columbian College. Now, as McCoy arrived in his first trip there to Philadelphia, he actually found the board all gone. They were all at Washington for the opening of Columbian College. And the same year that McCoy had opened the mission there at Fort Wayne, there was an announcement that they had taken $10,000 from the missionary funds to aid in the construction of Columbian College. And that's over $200,000. That's just a drop in the bucket of what they poured into that place over the time. Now, Stanton was also president of that college. Now, as we look at this, this would be a black hole that would just gobble up funds that were intended for other uses. This college was actually built on the backs of missionaries on the field. Monies that were intended for other things were diverted to this, including government monies, by the way. Now, I think what shows the whole attitude here really badly was this. This was intended to educate missionary children. Now, Rice and Josephus, two of McCoy's sons, would go there, and it was intended they were supposed to educate the missionaries' children free, and that was very much part of it. Now, a lot of it, support and others, came from other students coming in, but as in the spring of 1826, McCoy had several Indian students that he wanted to take to Columbian College. Some were to go for medicine, others for pastoral. And he'd written to the board and encouraged that. And the board had encouraged, Luther Rice had encouraged, bring them on. That we publish this, that we would raise the funds, raise the support for all that. And as he started out, a matter of fact, while he was on the way, a letter was sent, but he was long gone by that point. And he was encouraged to come. Luther Rice encouraged him to come. On the way in Kentucky, they were intercepted by a courier that told them to divert to an academy there that actually was no more than the education they'd already received. Now, he forged on. He came to find a board that was in disarray. There were some that were opposed. Lucius Bowles, who'd be the corresponding secretary, he was directly opposed. Some of the faculty at Columbia College were opposed. The excuse given was the students would never accept them. Well, problem with that was the students unanimously wrote a letter saying, we want to see them here. The faculty opposed, said there was no room or money. Offers of support actually came in that would have covered the entire cost of their education. But that was declined. The Indian students were rejected. McCoy wound up taking them up to Hamilton College, another Baptist institution that was not affiliated with the board. But he managed to take them up to that. But McCoy's sons were actually kicked out of the college and said, we cannot educate any missionary sons free anymore. Understand, folks, there were some faculty members that left because of that. And here is a college that was built on offerings that should have been for the missionaries, where those that are brought that could have been missionaries to the Indians, that could have helped them tremendously, now they're rejected. Now, folks, think about that for a second. That's awful. The whole extent of what went on with this college wasn't really realized until later. Monies were coming in for Indian improvement, and they were to be employed only for those purposes. Teaching, training, improvement, that idea. The monies were very often delayed. They're paid directly into the board, and the amounts were really not known to McCoy. And they weren't paid into the mission. Now, McCoy stood very firmly that these were to be separated. That was to go to pay a teacher. Now, many times McCoy had to pay a teacher out of his own pocket. McCoy many times would have to moonlight, I guess you could say. He was a wheelwright. And he'd also, he would build wheels, including spinning wheels, which, would be lucrative if he had to do it on the side. But many times he'd have to do that just to make ends meet. Others in the mission, Johnston Likens, which would become McCoy's son-in-law, started as a teacher, became a missionary under that. He was a doctor. So many times they use funds from outside work to help make men ends meet at the mission. And but as this happened, many times they'd have to pay the teachers out of their own pocket or whatever needed to be done. But where'd those monies go? They disappeared. They're not paid to the mission. Now, the Bible says in Matthew chapter 22, verse 21, as they present the question, are we to pay taxes? So Jesus says this, they say in him, as they respond, whose image and superscription? Say to him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. We as Baptists have stood for separation of church and state. Now, you might fault McCoy for taking the monies, but he was using these specifically to the purpose for which they were employed. Now, today, I think there's a lot greater problems that can happen with that. But all of these things created these financial issues, and, as Bowles came in, basically, he said the thing's bankrupt. Now, folks, that was dishonorable, and that was wrong. And that should have never happened. And as we go forward, the missionaries often put their own money into that. And after removal, the government paid the mission paid to the board the amount that the missions were worth, the buildings and all that, and any improvements put in. And they separated out anything that was put in separately by the missionaries that was not paid out of the board. When the carry station was sold, the board pocketed the improvements. And when Shawnee was built, which was a continuation of the carry mission, when Shawnee was built in Kansas, guess what? The board didn't want to pay. Likens paid for a lot of it out of his own pocket. The board pocketed the money and did that. Valley Towns, when that was sold in Tennessee, Evan Jones, another missionary, is done wrong by the board. He put in a great deal of his own money into improvements, and the government valued those improvements separately at $1,876. That had been handed over to the board on Jones's behalf with his name on it. Well, in 1845, Jones was looking through the government archives at Fort Gibson and found this had been done 7 years before. He put in a claim for the money to the board. You know what they said? No money would be forthcoming. And the board had decided not to honor any more drafts from him as they felt he was doing it for a dishonorable purpose. Wow. How do you even quantify that? 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 21 says this, providing for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. If you look at many biographers of McCoy, including Wyeth kind of skips over a portion of McCoy's life because he was looking at Baptist Indian missions and it wasn't too complimentary to what was written on the board. And folks, it's not just that. The papers of Isaac McCoy bear this out. But as we look at that, there was a problem here. There was financial malfeasance. It wasn't that they were pocketing it for their own use. They were not putting it where it was supposed to be done. In the case of government funds, that was also illegal. There were some other issues that were involved too, and that was control. Now, when they closed down the Western Mission, Staunton's letter kind of bears this out too, that there's a sense of control. They wanted to run everything. That McCoy sending Church Mariah Creek, and later as they formed the Potawatomi Mission Church there, they were under their authority. Didn't matter what those churches said. Well, the board's word was paramount. Now, this was interesting. When they closed down the Western Mission, J.M. Peck was actually ordered to go join McCoy in the mission there. Now, this is what they wrote to him. Brother Welsh is requested to continue his labors in St. Louis as a private minister and not as a missionary, no aid being promised him. Brother Peck is directed as speedily as practicable on the termination of the present year to remove to Fort Wayne and to join Reverend Isaac McCoy. Folks, that's not right. You don't dictate to a man where God calls him. Peck would remain mainly on the Illinois side there of St. Louis and would see God work there. Peck disagreed with the action. He'd write a letter to McCoy on September 4th of 1820. He said this, from the annual report of the Board of Missions, you probably learned they have ordered me to join you. From what I wrote them last spring, this is rather unexpected, has thrown me into much perplexity, as the path of duty to leave a region nearly destitute of a gospel ministry is distressing, and I do not see the least prospect that this region is to receive any supply from immigration. And folks, St. Louis still needs the gospel. But folks, that was control. They'd order McCoy, they'd order him how he was to conduct his ministry, and they would micromanage the missionaries. The board did not understand the needs of the Indians. They did not understand their how they lived and how they went about that. McCoy was dealing with nomadic tribes. They suggested to him that he run a day school. Well, that doesn't work very good when half your students just move every few months. That doesn't work very well. And a settled church was indeed impossible, too. If you can imagine sticking a church down in a town that moves every 3 weeks. It doesn't work. They wanted the Indians to pay for the schooling. As we've looked at, they were destitute. McCoy would have been seen as a charlatan like the same jerks that had been ripping him off. Terrible, terrible. A missionary knows best his field of labor. They would direct him to do all things, and certainly McCoy went out to all the villages. He evangelized on a regular basis. He went out and preached the gospel. He was never flamboyant in what he said. He never gave lists of specific people, but he reached out to people. People got saved, but he did it the way that was right, the way he felt was right. A missionary best knows his field of labor, and the local church has authority. Mariah Creek approved his move to Fort Wayne. The Potawatomi Mission Church approved the way he would do it. And the local church has authority. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 22 and verse 23. And hath put all things under his feet, and gave him to be the head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him that filleth in all. McCoy saw that. The board was often two-faced in how it did it, and they were ordered about. And folks eventually, and there were many other things, and we could probably go on for several hours as to what happened, but there were several points where the missionaries considered quitting. But what came to a culmination was this. Both an issue of control, both an issue of finances. They'd employed a man as a teacher named Ira Blanchard. They repeatedly had told the board, because of some things, he's not qualified to be a missionary. He's going to teach the children. That is his only purpose. Now, it seemed like he had a Christian character, but there were things just seemed like it disqualified. As things began to come out, it began to show his true colors. Now, the board hadn't been, again, financially hadn't been doing what they're supposed to. They hadn't sent his salary. This was provided by the government already. They didn't do that. But Blanchard decided, I'm going to be a pastor. He wasn't qualified. He demanded full recognition as a missionary and a pastor. He split the Church Shawnee mission. He actually divided some of the tribes that had had a lot of difficulties through the year. He was not sent. The church was not constituted properly. And what's more, before this, he was caught in a compromising position with another's wife. He explained his way out of it. Later, that was dealt with the church council. At the time, McCoy was away in Washington and trying to lobby for the Indians and the board. And they came back and to find this kind of situation that had happened. And in the meantime, he's organized this church that was not organized properly. He was not sent out. He split the church. And just a bad situation by a man that was not qualified to be a pastor. And he put in a request to the board that he be considered a missionary. At first it was turned around. Then the board made a complete U-turn and appointed him as a missionary and a pastor. And at the same time, they print an article that said that Isaac McCoy stopped being a missionary 11 years before, which was false. He went on full authority, even though he would also help with the government, help with laying out surveying, and actually bring some of the tribes that he ministered to, as well as many others, in to survey the land. He witnessed to them. But that was false, folks. It was a lie. And the irregular church in Blanchard began to accept members from the Methodists that were guilty of gross, unrepentant sin. I haven't even determined if they scripturally baptized them. It was disciplined by others in the association. Blanchard was dealt with. And then the final insult, senior missionaries, Likens, others, received a letter that they were teachers, that they never were missionaries. That, again, was a lie from the board. Why did this happen? They were trying to cover up what they did with the government funds and to retroactively make them a teacher seemed to make up some of that. Folks, that was not right. That was a lie. That was unethical. And that was, quite frankly, illegal. Why did the board do that? They were trying to cover their tracks. This led to the final split. Likens would also resign. Other missionaries would. There would be one that would actually side with this adulterer. Eventually, 6 years later, the board dismissed Blanchard and declared it and annulled his ordination, which they should have never ordained him as it was. That wasn't done irregular either. Isaac McCoy formed a new missions agency solely for the Indians, the American Indian Missionary Association, 1842. He would go on to lead that until he died. But I tell you what, folks, we can learn some things from this. Nothing is to be in control over the local church. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 23. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. You don't put two husbands in on something. It doesn't work that way. The church, its head is the Lord Jesus Christ, and that is the individual church. No organization, no convention, no association, nothing has the right to dictate to a local church what they do and where their money is spent. Should not be. Missionaries should be individually supported. As McCoy created the new Indian mission, he presented this. All designated funds went to where they were designated. And each missionary also needed to have a church that provided a portion of their support. So it was done rightly. Unfortunately, it was absorbed into the Home Mission Board of Southern Baptist Convention about 9 years later than that. And that thought of individual support disappeared from that. I firmly believe, folks, the Bible teaches that missionaries should be individually supported. As we looked at this here in Philippians, it went to a missionary. Now, when churches worked together, and churches did work together, it went for what it was intended for. Acts chapter 11, verse 29 and 30. Then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren which dwelt in Judea, which also they did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. Let me ask you a question. If you're part of a denominational group or a convention or what have you, where does your money go? Who are your missionaries? You can't say that, folks. There's a problem. Church of Philippi knew who their missionary was. Now, folks, as we look at McCoy's life, it was a difficult one. It was one that was hard, and the board made it harder. But to the very end, his heart was this, for the people that he ministered to. Even as he was shattered and unable to physically and unable to do what he used to do, shattered in body and health, walked with pronounced limp. He was stooped over, his rib cage had been crushed. Horrible health through his life. He traveled to Jeffersonville on June 1st of 1846 to preach, to present the Indian mission to raise funds for it. And 3 weeks later, he would be gone, catch a fever. And 3 weeks later, he went home to be with the Lord. His tombstone once said, "The Indian's friend, for them he toiled through life. For them in death he breathed his final prayer. Now from his toil he rests the care, the strife. He waits in heaven, his work to follow him there." His heart was there. Also said this, for nearly 30 years his entire time and energies were devoted to the civil and religious improvement of the Aboriginal tribes of this country. He projected and founded the plan of their colonization, their only hope, and the imperishable monument of his wisdom and benevolence. But McCoy was forgotten. Why? He went against the establishment. Beware of denominationalism. It's when we become denominationalistic that we lose our identity that we've always stood for, the local church. Hope this has been a blessing to your heart and an encouragement. We thank you very much. We hope these have been a blessing.